What's up guys, last video I showed you the V8 and took it in for that tune, so here's an update. So first off, I want to thank Matt from Bullet Performance Racing. Now I put all these details in the description down below. Go check out his Facebook page and his website. You can see a lot of the other cars he's worked on. Now Matt's really switched on when it comes to these Falcons and any of the Fords that are out there, because what's actually happened with the car, as you can see, there was a list of things that's come back. Now Matt's come back to me, called me up and told me, well, here's some of the issues that the vehicle's having. So he ran through each of these issues step by step. So the first thing he mentioned was that rising rate fuel regulator. What happened was I bought a cheap Chinese rising rate fuel regulator to get the car running. It was fine to actually get it switched on, but as soon as you actually put some fuel into it and it actually builds up, what happens? It goes up on a curve of how much fuel it forces in as your revs start to increase. Now what was happening in this cheap Chinese version is it'll actually get to a point where it'll go from 0 psi or whatever it starts off at up to a point around 20 to 30 psi, and then bang, just shoots straight up to basically full pressure, which is 52 psi. So what was happening is as I was revving and getting it up in the RPM, all of a sudden the engine would just get flooded with fuel. On top of the fuel being flooded into the engine, the existing tune that was on the chip wasn't really set up properly for the car, so that was causing issues where I was actually driving the car to Matt and actually dropping it off. The car was it was actually flooding the engine and therefore was causing those issues. Matt said to me that he needed to replace it, and I just said to him, yeah, what do you suggest? And he's basically put in a new TurboSmart rising rate fuel regulator. So TurboSmart being, you know, a quite reliable brand. I was happy to pay to get that switched over because we needed to get it up and running. The next issue which Matt had also looked at when he put the car up on a hoist, he actually found that the sway bar was actually a lot bigger than what was designed for that vehicle. So what I'm assuming is that the person who owned the vehicle before me had actually put on a bigger sway bar. What that's actually doing is that the sway bar is rubbing against the rubbers. What that's actually done is it's knocked the rubbers out and it's to basically be sitting without any of those rubbers there. Now Matt's actually popped those back in, so at the moment it's actually gonna be fine, but I'll need to switch over that sway bar at some point, so I'll probably do another video on that some point down the track. Next was the supercharger pulley. Now you might have noticed in the last video that I did on the car, the supercharger pulley made a bit of a squeal, and that was because one of the pulleys is actually bent a little bit and is actually causing some friction or some noise there. So Matt was able to bend it back in a bit. Now I'm not sure if we'll need to take that off and do some more work to it down the track, but if I ever switch the pulleys out, then I'll be able to straighten it then. Now the next thing was the fuel rail. So the fuel rail was actually gunked up. Now what has actually happened is when I originally put the fuel rail in a long time ago, I'd actually used an aviation glue type of sealant, which is quite good stuff to use, but the issue is that if you use too much and you actually screw the fitting in, if you use too much of that sealant, it actually leaks into the actual rail or whatever it is that you've connected it to. Now in this case, that sealant then goes hard and actually turns into like these little pebbles, like these little balls, which you can see in that photo. Now that's all fine to then clean that up and pull that out, which he's done, so which is good. But the only downside now is that all those little pebbles have actually worked their way into the injectors. Now the injectors themselves, the baskets are all clogged up. So I've got another photo here. You can see where the injectors, how they're set up, and up the top there's the little basket up there which collects things if there is something in the fuel rail, and in this case they've clogged up with these little pebbles. What Matt's done is he's actually pulled all the injectors out and he's run it through a injector cleaning machine which he has, and that's cleaned the injectors completely, and he's able to then reuse them and put those back in. Now, one of the other things with the injectors, I had one of the injectors turned around. It was switched 180 degrees to how you'd normally have it. Now, the reason I did that is because one of the fittings was actually in the way, and I couldn't actually have the plug to put the plug on the injector because of that fitting. So what I did was turned it, but what Matt's let me know is that the injectors themselves actually have a direction that they need to squirt in, and changing that around actually affects how the fuel is actually injected into the manifold. So Matt's been able to do is get a separate fitting that allows for that first fitting I had to kind of be out of the way, and therefore the injector can actually be placed in the right direction, which needed to be done anyway, because that fitting that was actually in the way was not able to be done up enough. It was causing the fuel rail to actually leak. That meant that whenever the fuel was switched on, it was actually slowly leaking out of that fitting and was filling up inside the manifold area. It is an issue to have leaking fuel, but what made it even worse was this last point, which was one of the injectors that I had. I actually had to extend the wiring on that injector. Now, when doing that, I temporarily had done the wiring on that injector, but hadn't heat shrinked the actual wires themselves yet. And because the car was sitting there for so long, I'd completely forgot about it. And what I actually had was two loose wires sitting next to each other on that injector, next to a leaking fuel fitting. And so if those two wires had actually touched, that would have caused a spark and been really bad. Luckily that didn't happen, and luckily Matt picked up on it, and basically he's done the fix to all of these things. So thanks, Matt. And basically now he's just running it on the dyno. Now, he's done a few runs so far. The first couple he had all these issues, so that didn't actually go too well, but since then he's basically just been running it. And now one of the things he has told me is that because the head gaskets have been sitting on there for so long, and basically they've probably gotten quite hard, and that he believes that if he tries to push it a lot harder than what he could, that he'll blow a head gasket. So he's kind of backed the timings off a bit already, and he's going to be slowly dialing it in until he gets it nice and running nice and such. But basically I've told him, yep, I'm happy just for you to get it working and running. We'll see what we've got. We can then do whatever modifications we need to down the track, and then put it back on the dyno again if we want to push some more power out of it. But in the meantime, he's going to see what he can do. So make sure to check out his Facebook page and website and all that stuff down below. That's about it from me. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe so you can keep up to date with all these new videos, and we'll see you next time.